O Pioneers, Chapter 3, Part 1. One Sunday afternoon in July, 6 months after John Bergson's death, Carl was sitting in the doorway of the Lindstrom kitchen, dreaming over an illustrated paper, when he heard the rattle of a wagon along the hill road. Looking up, he recognized the Bergsons' team, with 2 seats in the wagon, which meant they were off for a pleasure excursion. Oscar and Lou, on the front seat, wore their cloth hats and coats, never worn except on Sundays, and Emile, on the second seat with Alexandra, sat proudly in his new trousers made from a pair of his father's and a pink striped shirt with a wide ruffled collar. Oscar stopped the horses and waved to Carl, who caught up his hat and ran through the melon patch to join them. "Want to go with us?" Lou called. "We're going to Crazy Ivar's to buy a hammock." "Sure." Carl ran up panting, and clambering over the wheels, sat down beside Emile. "I've always wanted to see Ivar's pond. They say it's the biggest in all the country." "Aren't you afraid to go to Ivar's in that new shirt, Emile? He might want it and take it right off your back." Emile grinned. "I'd be awful scared to go," he admitted, "if you big boys weren't along to take care of me." "Did you ever hear him howl, Carl? People say sometimes he runs about the country howling at night because he is afraid the Lord will destroy him. Mother thinks he must have done something awful wicked." Lou looked back and winked at Carl. "What would you do, Emile, if you was out on the prairie by yourself and seen him coming?" Emile stared. "Maybe I would hide in a badger hole," he suggested doubtfully. "But suppose there wasn't any badger hole," Lou persisted. "Would you run?" "No, I'd be too scared to run," Emile admitted mournfully, twisting his fingers. "I guess I'd sit right down on the ground and say my prayers." The big boys laughed, and Oscar brandished his whip over the broad backs of the horses. "He wouldn't hurt you, Emile," said Carl persuasively. "He came to doctor our mare when she ate green corn and swelled up most as big as the water tank. He petted her just like you do your cats. I couldn't understand much what he said, for he don't talk any English, but he kept patting her and groaning as if he had the pain himself and saying, 'There now, sister, that's easier, that's better.'" Lou and Oscar laughed, and Emile giggled delightedly and looked up at his sister. "I don't think he knows anything at all about doctoring," said Oscar scornfully. "They say when horses have distemper, he takes the medicine himself and then prays over the horses." Alexandra spoke up. "That's what the crows said, but he cured their horses all the same. Some days his mind is cloudy-like, but if you can get him on a clear day, you can learn a great deal from him. He understands animals. Didn't I see him take the horn off the Berquist cow when she had torn it loose and went crazy? She was tearing all over the place, knocking herself against things, and at last she ran out on the roof of the old dugout and her legs went through, and there she stuck, bellowing. Ivar came running with his white bag, and the moment he got to her she was quiet and let him saw her horn off and daub the place with tar." Emile had been watching his sister, his face reflecting the sufferings of the cow. "And then didn't it hurt her any more?" he asked. Alexandra patted him. "No, not any more, and in 2 days they could use her milk again." The road to Ivar's homestead was a very poor one. He had settled in the rough country across the county line, where no one lived but some Russians, 6 families who dwelt together in one long house divided off like barracks. Ivar had explained his choice by saying the fewer neighbors he had, the fewer temptations. Nevertheless, when one considered that his chief business was horse doctoring, it seemed rather short-sighted of him to live in the most inaccessible place he could find. The Bergson wagon lurched along over the rough hummocks and grass banks, followed the bottom of winding draws, or skirted the margin of wide lagoons where the golden coropsis grew up out of the clear water, and the wild ducks rose with a whir of wings. Lou looked after them helplessly. "I wish I'd brought my gun anyway, Alexandra," he said fretfully. "I could have hidden it under the straw in the bottom of the wagon." Then we'd have had to lie to Ivar. Besides, they say he can smell dead birds, and if he knew, we wouldn't get anything out of him, not even a hammock. I want to talk to him, and he won't talk sense if he's angry. It makes him foolish. Lou sniffed. Who ever heard of him talking sense anyhow? I'd rather have ducks for supper than crazy Ivar's tongue. Emil was alarmed. But Lou, you don't want to make him mad. He might howl. They all laughed again, and Oscar urged the horses up the crumbling side of the clay bank. They had left the lagoons and the red grass behind them. In Crazy Ivar's country, the grass was short and gray, the draws deeper than they were in the Bergsons' neighborhood, and the land was all broken up into hillocks and clay ridges. The wildflowers disappeared, and only in the bottom of the draws and gullies grew a few of the very toughest and hardiest, shoestring and ironweed and snow on the mountain. Look, Emil, there's Ivar's big pond. Alexandra pointed to a shining sheet of water that lay at the bottom of a shallow draw. At one end of the pond was an earthen dam planted with green willow bushes, and above it a door and a single window were set in the hillside. You would not have seen them at all but for the reflection of the sunlight upon the 4 panes of window glass. And that was all you saw. Not a shed, not a corral, not a well, not even a path broken in the curly grass. But for the piece of rusty stovepipe sticking up through the sod, you could have walked over the roof of Ivar's dwelling without dreaming that you were near a human habitation. Ivar had lived for 3 years in the clay bank without defiling the face of nature any more than the coyote that had lived there before him had done. When the Bergsons drove over the hill, Ivar was sitting in the doorway of his house, reading the Norwegian Bible. He was a queerly shaped old man with a thick, powerful body set on short bow legs. His shaggy white hair, falling in a thick mane about his ruddy cheeks, made him look older than he was. He was barefoot, but he wore a clean shirt of unbleached cotton open at the neck. He always put on a clean shirt when Sunday morning came around, though he never went to church. He had a peculiar religion of his own and could not get on with any of the denominations. Often he did not see anybody from one week's end to another. He kept a calendar, and every morning he checked off a day so that he was never in any doubt as to which day of the week it was. Ivar hired himself out in threshing and corn-husking time, and he doctored sick animals when he was sent for. When he was at home, he made hammocks out of twine and committed chapters of the Bible to memory.